Did you know that you're 40% more likely to die from any cause if you eat a lot of ultra-processed food?
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
Now, welcome back. Inside today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about not only just these ultra-processed, hyper-palatable foods that are easy to overconsume calories and don't contain a lot of micronutrients, but also the involvement of US tobacco companies in the production of these foods, or basically having any type of investment or ownership in these foods. So it's no secret that hyper-palatable, ultra-processed foods are not necessarily the best for us, right? They contain a fair amount of calories. They're not necessarily providing a lot of protein or vitamins and minerals. They're not very satiating, so it's very easy to overeat, even if you are someone that goes in with good intentions of maybe just having a bite or two. And we have to understand is, these foods are kind of hard for the average person to avoid at the grocery store. They're incredibly prevalent. They're put on different end caps. They have the best marketing and packaging, and that's not by accident. Millions of dollars of research and development and also marketing budget go into the addictive potential of these foods and also the promotion and placement of these foods in the store. Remember, when you go to the grocery store, this is not necessarily just, hey, these are the best foods for you. You need to eat these foods. We're making these available because these are all health promoting foods. No, that's not the case. The grocery store is a business, and also the foods that are on the shelves, a lot of those are very big businesses, and they certainly make a lot of money and are very successful in getting people to buy these foods and consume a lot of them quite frequently. Now, what's super interesting about the parents of these large processed food businesses, right? So if we look up kind of through the hierarchy, not just the investors that exist in like the S&P 500 or people who maybe own stock in certain companies, but a lot of the parent companies of these large processed food businesses know something about addiction. And the reason that they do is because they were tied to the cigarette and tobacco industry for a very long period of time. And this has been confirmed via many published studies. So this is not just my opinion. This is not just me speculating. There have been recent studies. So there's a couple here. One is by Torres, another by Fazzino, and these were released as recently as 2023 and 2024, empirical evidence and current implications in regard to US tobacco companies selectively disseminating hyperpalatable foods into the US food system. There's also a conversation around the high consumption of ultra-processed foods associated with higher total mortality in an adult Mediterranean population. So one of these is from a clinical nutrition journal. The other one is actually from more of an addiction-based conversation and journal. So I'll touch a little bit more on this second part in a bit in regards to the American tobacco companies and their involvement. So let's talk about big tobacco. Big tobacco was basically at its height in the 1950s and 1960s. Post-World War II in the United States was a great time to be an American tobacco company, after which sales declined largely due to education around smoking risk, lung cancer, and the implications of basically having a lot of cigarettes. And sales have declined steadily to where they are today. They might have seen the writing on the wall as sales were declining, since right around 1980, tobacco giants R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris acquired Kraft, General Foods, and Nabisco. Now, Nabisco, obviously you may remember Nabisco having some involvement with different cookies and things. Kraft, you may remember like the boxed Kraft mac and cheese commercials from back in the day. And they decided to take their business model with cigarettes, which was essentially addiction, and try to transfer it to the food industry. This does not sound very promising for Americans consuming these foods. Now, these companies were obviously producing ultra-processed foods prior to being acquired, but not really to the extent that they've been pumping out these foods today, and not necessarily with the sort of deliberate R&D and addictive properties or nature that some of these things may have. Now, between 1988 and 2001, if you compare the tobacco-owned companies to other food companies at the time, tobacco companies were 80% more likely to be putting what would be classified as ultra-processed carbohydrates and sodium-rich foods into the food system, and 29% more likely to be putting out ultra-processed fats and sodium-rich foods. Now, if you compare that to the numbers in 2018, every large food company was equally likely to be putting out these foods, indicating the prevalence of these in the food system. Now, the 2024 study I mentioned was basically analyzing this, and where some of these statistics are from is how involved they are in promoting these different addictive foods or different properties of these foods that are very easy to overconsume, right? Anytime we're having a conversation around food, and there's a lot of social media conversation right now around people who will compare food and over-consuming food, or maybe even binging on food, and food addiction, or that term in air quotes, food addiction, relative to drugs. I think these need to be discussed separately, and while foods may be very easy to overeat and very easy to overconsume because they're hyper-palatable and have very unique properties that basically trigger us to want to overconsume, and they're not very satiating, and they provide a high amount of calories, and our body is essentially wanting more and more because they taste very, very good. I still think this needs to be a separate conversation from like hardcore drug use, right? So sometimes people on social media try to make that comparison. Let's have a nutrition conversation here today. That's what I'm here for, is to talk about the nutrition, this kind of science behind this, versus there are people who will try to make this comparison online between drugs and alcohol and food. So mainly today's podcast and YouTube video, the purpose is to talk about this food education versus trying to compare addictive properties of things, versus just simply having the discussion that there are things being pumped into the food system that are basically ultra processed, so multi ingredient, hyper palatable foods that are including, these ultra processed carbohydrates, higher amounts of not only sodium, but other flavorings and seasonings that are driving over consumption, right? It's not just only salt that's the problem. And the fact that tobacco companies are 80% more likely to put these into the food system, certainly a problem, and 29% more likely to be putting these ultra-processed fat and sodium-rich foods. So this would be things that, this is where you start to see the conversation online where people are talking about different seed oils and things like that, as well as not only just the types of fats and the type of carbohydrates, but the density of this, and not a good nutrient density, right? This is like a caloric density in the amount of a serving of food, right? It's like 2 little crackers or cookies is gonna have tons of calories, versus if you were to eat like an apple or a bowl of berries, or if you were to have like a lean piece of animal protein. Very, very different from a satiety perspective, and also the caloric density. So that's what we're talking about in terms of ease of overconsumption. There's a lot of different debate and sort of speculation around processed food. Like people will say, well, even oatmeal is processed, or even rice is processed, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about packaged food. We're talking about foods that have a lot of ingredients, foods that have essentially what would be smaller serving sizes if you were to measure it or actually weigh it out, which most people are not doing if they're consuming these foods, and the taste of these foods, right? They're hyper palatable, they're very high calorie, they're very easy to overeat. We're not talking about people overeating, steak and a baked potato, or a piece of fish and overeating fruit, right? That's not what's happening here. These are multi ingredient foods that are very, very tasty and very easy to overeat. Now, maybe you've gotten to a point in your health and fitness journey where they're not tasty to you anymore, but to a lot of people in the United States and Western world as a whole, these are very easy to eat a lot of these foods. So I mentioned it at the beginning of the show, but a recent study from the Mediterranean region basically showed that compared to the lowest portion of processed food consumption to the highest, showed a 40% increased risk of dying from all causes, or basically any cause. Now, exactly, you might wonder, like, how much was this highest subset of this group or this research eating? And at least 12.6% of their diet was coming from ultra-processed foods. Now, think of this again as picture like a packaged food in front of you popping up on the screen. And these were ultra processed foods by weight, which still doesn't seem like a ton, right? That's, a little over a tenth of their diet when you're looking at about 12%. And in addition, this highest subset was also 53% more likely to die from cancer. Not just get it, but die from it. So many individuals, as they age, will die with cancer, just as a byproduct of living for a longer period of time. But there's definitely something to be said about these people dying from that cancer versus dying with that cancer. So for example, many men with age may have traces or small signs of prostate cancer as they get to advanced age, but there's a difference between having something present in your body and being at an advanced age like 80, 90 years old, and you're dying from other causes, but you happen to have that present in your body versus dying from that. Now, 39% were more likely to die from cardiovascular disease, which obviously is a very prominent risk factor for many individuals. We also have other data showing even greater effects. So a 62% increase in all-cause mortality was shown from a recent cohort in Spain when comparing over 4 servings of processed foods to under 2 servings per day. So basically the difference is people who are only consuming it once or twice a day versus people who are having upwards of 4 of these foods that are like multi-ingredient, high-calorie, hyper-palatable foods. We have other data from other countries that mirrors this, but rather than belabor the point here, we'll kind of move on from this particular instance. We also have other data showing even greater effects. A 62% increase in all-cause mortality when we basically look at a specific group of individuals from Spain studied in the research, where they were basically comparing 4 servings of this hyper-palatable, hyper-processed food per day versus people who are only having it about twice per day or less. There's other data from other countries that will mirror these statistics, but instead of belaboring the point, just understand this has been represented not only in this study of a Mediterranean population, and that was about 12% of the diet, but then also when we look to Spain, the difference that we see is essentially in 4 servings or more versus 2 servings or less. And that was a 62% increase in all-cause mortality. Now, realize that individuals may include a small amount of these foods, and it may be done in a way that still fits their overall energy budget, right? Some people are able to eat these foods and have a very small amount or have a serving and enjoy that serving and not completely blow the rest of their nutritional intake. Some people have a very hard time moderating their intake of these foods because they do have properties that make them very tasty, they're hyper-palatable, they're very easy to overeat, it's very hard to control our portions. And so for some people, it may be wise to exclude some of these foods for a period of time until we're able to have the bulk of our nutrition intake, the bulk of our human diet, being nutrient dense, single ingredient whole foods. But understand that that's not the entire population, right? If you've been doing this for a long period of time, if you're listening to my show, you've probably been someone who has a interest in health and fitness for a while. But if you're newer to this and these foods have made up the bulk of your diet, you kind of have to start somewhere by prioritizing some of the more filling, satiating, nutrient-dense foods that are rich in protein, vitamins and minerals, antioxidants. And if we're not intentionally consuming those foods first to create a bit of a buffer in terms of our hunger, it is just so easy to overeat these multi-ingredient foods that are very, very hyper-palatable and almost designed to be, consumed in a sitting and then leave you wanting more. And so I really do feel for folks who, and I can be like this too. So growing up, I was like a little snack monster. And it wasn't until I learned how to kind of manage appetite using certain foods that do promote satiety, that are more filling, because I wasn't someone who would necessarily get that feeling of fullness from that food in the middle of the grocery store, grabbing it from the package, and you start eating, and maybe a serving is like 2 cookies, or I was actually recently interviewed on a podcast. I was on Mark Bell's Power Project, and we're talking about these different foods, and we're talking about eating the entire sleeve of Oreos. And for some people, maybe they're able to have just one, but there are individuals who have a really hard time moderating that intake and need to first develop a sense of awareness of how they're feeling around those foods and what certain foods lead them to do, because it's not always just that one food, right? It's what food are we consuming after that food? Sometimes foods are almost like gateway foods. If you were to eat a single ingredient food, you have some lean animal protein, maybe you have some fruit, or maybe you have a single ingredient carbohydrate. Very rarely are you going from eating that food and all of a sudden that's a gateway into consuming all of these other snacks, versus it would be very easy to grab a couple things at the grocery store, eat a few bites, and all of a sudden just be be on this full snack rampage. There are some individuals who are very good at, maybe having a bite, putting it down, walking away. Not everybody, that is kind of a skill that people have developed, or they have the ability to do so. Not everyone is in that camp. And so sometimes I think people lose that perspective that some people do have a hard time moderating that intake and consuming smaller amounts. And so when they keep it in their house, it leads to less favorable behaviors. So I'm not 100% for or against anything really. I've figured out what works best for me. And when working with clients and helping other health professionals over the years, I've kind of figured out what works either for them or the people that they're trying to serve, the people that they're trying to help, right? In many cases, nutrition needs to be individualized, but there are some general principles and frameworks that can be applied to the broader population. Like many of us need protein to help manage our appetite and satiety, and we do need it from the perspective of getting essential amino acids and key nutrients. There are certain single ingredient whole foods that are going to promote much more satiety than walking down the grocery store. So like in the podcast example, if we're talking about an apple versus having two cookies, the two little cookies are not going to be as filling probably as someone consuming that apple. Now, do people still get enjoyment from eating those foods? Certainly. But I also think there's a difference between having certain foods that are very palatable, and maybe it's a homemade meal, or maybe you're consuming those foods with loved ones, or there's a community component to it, versus a lot of these foods being pushed by some of these tobacco companies are just things that oftentimes people are eating either on the go or in isolation, or not really paying any sort of attention to serving sizes or overall caloric consumption. And that's why such a significant portion of the population is overweight or obese. And what we need to have a conversation around is like understanding how the sort of food science behind these foods makes them hyperpalatable, how they're so easy to overeat. The caloric density is there, but the micronutrient density is certainly not there at all. So, this isn't to say that you can't ever, go home and your great grandma is making your favorite pie on Thanksgiving, right? That's like a different conversation around like a home cooked meal. And yes, that has higher calories. It's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about companies that have been involved. So whether it was Reynolds or looking at the acquisition of Kraft Foods, Philip Morris in that conversation, these companies are engineering and designing things in a way that they are very hyperpalatable and easy to overeat. And many people just fail to remember that when they're walking into the store, this is a business. This is not necessarily just, hey, these foods are here because all of these are healthy for you. And maybe some people haven't reached a level of awareness yet with their nutrition, or even the intentionality around nutrition to make those healthier choices and be able to buffer against overconsumption of some of these foods or food ingredients. It's also weird to call some of these things foods because they're literally engineered in a way, packaged in so many different ingredients, versus we're almost in like a different genre entirely versus some of the things that you would buy, maybe shop in like the perimeter of the grocery store, right? So nutrition has to be individualized. The context is really important here. And I also think just remembering that there's a significant financial conversation that's being had behind closed doors around what's going to happen when people do overconsume these foods and they buy more and they truly enjoy it and they do it again and again and again, and they're not full and they're buying, these essentially cheaper snack foods versus other foods from that nutrition perspective. And if you're a coach, you're a health professional, you've probably experienced this in trying to help steer people towards a healthier way of living and getting more micronutrients, getting more protein, managing their appetite. I talk about whether it's biofeedback, sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress, and shreds. Hunger is a big part of that. If we can't regulate hunger, very hard to hit our transformation goals. In Metabolism Made Simple, I talk about the 5 M's of managing metabolism. One of those is managing our appetite and maximizing adherence. If we can't do those 2 of the 5 things, it's going to be really, really hard to achieve our health and fitness goals. And if you do want to check that out, you can head to metabolismmadesimple.com to learn more about the book overall. In terms of some of this conversation around nutrition, if you are a health and fitness professional who's interested in understanding the impact on our physiology and how these things may impact our pursuit of our physical goals, definitely check out the nutrition and metabolism specialization. You can learn more about that at metabolismschool.com. And if you're interested in more written content, video content, etc., check out sammillerscience.com for more. If you enjoyed this episode or appreciated today's conversation, bringing some of these things to light and even exposing what's going on in terms of these tobacco companies investing in food and understanding I hate to use the word addiction outside of like the drugs and alcohol conversation, but some of these foods are just very easy to overeat, very easy to overconsume, and people are getting this abundance of calories in a very, very, very short period of time in one sitting, very easy to overeat. So if this is something you think needs to be shared with the world, screenshot it, share it with a friend, or grab the link or URL wherever you're listening and share it one-on-one, or post it to your social media. Tag me, I'm at Sam Miller Science. And I always appreciate when you guys give a thumbs up on YouTube or leave a comment if this resonated with you. If you're on the audio feed, the best way to support the content is with a 5-star rating and review. So on Spotify, you can leave that 5-star rating. It literally takes 3 seconds. So if you haven't done it and you're a repeat listener, please do it today. Don't wait for another day, do it now. And if you're on Apple Podcasts and you repeatedly listen to the show, there's a way you can drop both a rating and review. And so that is really the only quote unquote fee for listening to the show. I don't run a ton of ads here. I try to provide a lot of no cost educational content related to nutrition, related to fitness, lifestyle, overall health, and better understanding our internal health and physiology. And so if you can support my team by leaving that rating and review, it would mean the world to me, and it'll probably mean the world to someone who can either change their life for the better, or maybe they're an aspiring health and fitness professional and they can use this information to help someone else. So when you pay it forward, leaving that rating and review, it's not just for me, it's also for other people who are gonna find the show, or maybe they listen to it because of your rating or because of your review. If you enjoy it and you are just trying to be selfish and you binge the episodes and you download it and you're one of the people that's the reason that we hit 1 million unique downloads on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, then what I would say is make sure you're subscribed so you never miss anything, and that way you always get the latest and greatest content in the feed. I appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for listening or watching today's show. If you're on the audio and you haven't checked out YouTube yet, you can find me. I'm at Sam Miller Science. I appreciate you guys, and I will talk to you in the next one.